LinkedIn presents.
I'm Caleb Bissinger, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, why you were born to explore. When I was in sixth grade, we did this thing called the Explorers Project. Every kid in the class was assigned an adventurer from the Age of Discovery. I got Captain James Cook. And we spent weeks just learning everything we could about them. 30 years later, that classroom project is still my anchor when I think about what it means to be an explorer. I picture swashbuckling rogues, hobbled by peg legs and scurvy, greedily sailing into uncharted waters. But Alex Hutchinson has a different definition.
When I'm talking about exploring, I'm talking about something that involves making a choice so that you're taking an uncertain pathway. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, which inherently means that there is the possibility of failure. You're putting something at risk, you're taking a chance, and you don't know how it's going to turn out.
In his new book, The Explorer's Gene, Why We Seek Big Challenges, New Flavors, and the Blank Spots on the Map, Alex marshals the latest findings in anthropology, neuroscience, and biology to show that you don't have to be Columbus or Earhart to call yourself an explorer. The itch for the new is hardwired into all of us, and we can satisfy it in ways both big and small.
Whether it's climbing a mountain or getting furniture from IKEA or having kids, exploring is an amazing source of meaningfulness, of a sense of purpose, of a sense of satisfaction.
All things we're increasingly missing out on. We're exploring less and less. Research shows that creativity scores in kids are declining. Adults are stuck in routines we never question. We're not just missing out on new discoveries, we're missing out on what makes life worth living. So how can you become a better explorer, whether in the wilderness or from the comfort of your own home, in your career path, or even in what you order for dinner tonight? And what might we lose as a society if we don't rekindle our exploratory instincts? That's coming up after the break.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Alex Hutchinson, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thanks, Caleb. It's great to be here.
So you've got this great new book out. It's called The Explorer's Gene. But writing it, you say, was not, quote, the obvious move. Why not? Why was this not the obvious book for you to write?
So the story is, back in 2018, I wrote a book called Endure, which was one of the inaugural selections for the Next Big Idea Club. So
it sure was.
Longtime members may recall. And to, I think, everyone's surprise, including my own, the book did really well. And it was really the culmination of like 10 years of reporting on this idea of the science of endurance, the science of human limits, the role of the brain. It was a topic I was super fascinated in. And it was like, hey, everything's working out. I can spend the rest of my career as the science of endurance guy. Like, awesome. Right. The standard advice, which I got from everyone is, get cracking on Endure too. As I was thinking about it, it's not that I have nothing more to say about endurance, but I just didn't find it attractive as an idea for reasons like I couldn't overrule the feeling that it didn't sound as interesting as writing Endure 1 had been. and that I wanted to have that experience. So I started to think about what else do I want to write a book about? But I also started to think about why is it that I don't want to take the obvious route? Why is it that I'm attracted to the leaping into the unknown and doing something completely different? And that started to connect with other things I've noticed about myself, other ideas or interests in my life. And so I ended up deciding, well, let's dig into this. Let's try and understand why it is that not just me, that many of us, or I would even argue all of us to some extent, are drawn to the unknown.
Yeah, and drawn to fresh exploration. And obviously, we're going to pull on that thread a bunch in this conversation. But stay here for a minute and talk a little bit about yourself, because you actually have, and you write about this so elegantly in the book, you have this sort of track record of going down a path with incredible focus and commitment and then swerving.
So yeah, my background is I studied physics in university, and I followed it, as you said, not, quite a ways. I did a PhD after my undergrad, and then I worked as a postdoctoral researcher in quantum computing for a couple of years. And it was only when I was 28 that I was like, yeah, I mean, the physics is interesting, but I'm not that passionate about it. And I made this huge left turn to leave my physics postdoc and go to journalism school. And journalism was a topic I knew very little, like it was truly the unknown. I knew very little about it.
Where did that come from? Because it is such a left turn. And it's also kind of left brain, right brain. I know those are sort of dubious distinctions, but... So,
I mean, one thing I haven't talked about is actually, I had some family modeling, or maybe it's the explorer's gene. My dad was an oil field engineer in Alberta, working in the oil fields. And at 28, he was like, "Nah, I don't want to do this." And he went back to study religious studies and ended up being a professor of ethics. So it's like,
oh, so this is in the blood. Okay.
And then my brother, he was doing graduate work in pure mathematics. And at 28, he was like, "Nah, screw this. I want to be an archivist." And he went and did a degree in archives science. And in both those cases, there was a similar kind of like starting out in the science and then saying, actually, I'm looking for something a little different. So in terms of why I decided to make this leap when I was 28, it's very, very hard to know what was really happening. Like I've thought about it a lot, and I can tell the story in retrospect, but ultimately I think probably the most accurate or the most truthful statement is that journalism sounded like an adventure. It sounded like a chance to be able to explore lots of different paths rather than having to pick one thing to study for the rest of my life. Journalism is a vehicle to be able to make left turns and right turns and forward and backward and study things.
I mean, you get to be a professional dilettante. So, okay, so you have this sense of adventure. You're fascinated by exploration. You're starting to noodle on this other book that's not Endure, the sequel, but is something else. And something you stumbled upon, or maybe you knew about it already, but that sort of forms the intellectual framework of this book you end up writing, is this 1991 paper written by a Stanford Business School professor named James Marsh. Tell us about that paper. What is the theory that James Marsh put forward, and why was that a light bulb moment for you?
I think the title of the paper was Exploration and Exploitation in Organizational Learning, but the phrase that has sort of entered the pop culture lore is the explore-exploit dilemma. So this idea that in many contexts, we're faced with a decision between taking advantage of the things we know, like let's say you've got a PhD in physics. Do you exploit that PhD in physics to take a job in physics or to go and do consulting or investment banking, whatever the case may be? Or do you say, let's throw out what we know, let's explore something completely different? And so James Marsh was writing about it in the context of corporate decision making. So you can say, I'm a company. Should I exploit this product line that we've developed by spending money marketing it to sell more of it? Or should I explore by funneling the money to R&D to build a new product that's going to replace our current product? And the smart answer is, well, you should do a little bit of both. But the truth is, you can't give everything you've got to both of those options at any given point. You have to prioritize. You have to make decisions. And those decisions are not just like corporate decisions or societal decisions in terms of how we allocate R&D money, which are obviously is a big topic these days. It's also personal decisions. It's also you go to a restaurant and, you've been there before. Do you order what you had last time, which was pretty good? Or do you order something completely different, which might be better? Maybe it sounds pretty good, but it might also be awful. And you don't know until you try it. So do you take the bird in the hand or go for two in the bush? Once you start thinking about things in terms of the explore-exploit dilemma, you realize that this is actually sort of one of the fundamental kind of meta choices that's going on all the time and everywhere in our lives.
You cite so many great examples in the book, from personal dilemmas to, you have a great riff on Hollywood and why it is that the entire film industry has been completely taken over by sequels and reboots and, iteration number 354 of the Fast and Furious movies, right? And that's exploit, right? That is going back to the well again and again and again, as opposed to exploring, trying new creative, trying new ideas. So you see it just everywhere. Certainly, I get the sense reading the earlier parts of the book that you feel that as a culture, as a society, we are leaning a little too hard on exploit mode versus explore mode, right? Personally, culturally, business, we're a little too much in the comfort zone and we're a little too afraid sometimes to explore.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start by saying that when I started working on the book, I assumed that the subtitle would end up being something like "The Case for Exploring More," why we all need to explore, it's all about more, explore. But I came away with a more nuanced perspective, maybe a greater appreciation for the benefits of exploiting. And exploiting is a word that has baggage, right? But I'm not talking about it in terms of taking advantage of people, but exploiting our existing knowledge, that there are times when it absolutely makes sense to exploit. And you can think of exploit as kind of 10,000 hours, right, of doing the work. There are times when you have to knuckle down and stick with the thing that you already know and push it as far as it can go. So finding the balance between exploring and exploiting is important. That being said, if we tend to err in one direction or the other, we tend to err on the side of not exploring enough. And that was actually, you go back to James March's paper in 1991, that was his fundamental argument or conclusion, is that in a corporate context, when you exploit, you send some money to marketing, you get immediate feedback that is, hey, look, our sales went up. This is good. Mm-hmm. Whoever made that decision, let's give them a promotion. Let's double down on this. If you decide, no, let's spend that money on R&D, then, a year later in the annual report, it's like, well, what did that money lead to? Well, nothing. Is it going to lead to anything? We don't know. When are we going to find out? We don't know. So the feedback for exploring is delayed and it's uncertain and it's often negative. And so the more we move to what a friend of mine, Michael Joyner, he's a physiologist at the Mayo Clinic, he's always worrying about ROI thinking, that we're always asking, what's the return on the investment of this move we're going to make? And if you do that, then it's going to prejudice you to always wanting to exploit, because the ROI, at least in the short term, in the narrower view, is positive. A great example of that is there's this analysis of food delivery data from a food delivery company called Deliveroo, which is it's like Uber Eats.
It's like the UK equivalent of DoorDash or something.
Exactly.
Right?
So researchers at Harvard got hold of this trove of data from, it's 2 million orders from hundreds of thousands of customers. So they can look, well, in a real world, outside the lab, how do people make explore, exploit decisions? How do they choose what to order? And there's lots of stuff that comes out of this, including the fact that all else being equal, we do tend to like unexplored restaurants. We're actually more likely to order from a restaurant with fewer ratings than one with more ratings, which is counterintuitive to me.
So counterintuitive,
Not what I would have guessed at all. But it's the one with 500 ratings, it's a 4.1 star restaurant. The one with 5 ratings, maybe it's the best restaurant in the world. No one has figured it out yet. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is that one of the things in this Deliveroo data is that when you try a restaurant you haven't tried before, on average, you will get a worse meal. You will have a lesser chance of having a 5-star meal. So you can see that what's the feedback loop? It's it seems like on average when I explore, I get a worse meal. Why should I explore? But in the long term, if you explore, your ratings go steadily upwards. Your average rating goes upwards because as you explore, you get some good meals, you get some great meals, and you get some bad meals. You never go back to the bad place. But the great meals, you say, well, okay, I'm going to substitute my rotation. I'm going to dump this other restaurant that was okay with this one that's great. And so you end up with a better ensemble of choices to choose from by exploring. But that is hard to discern in the short-term feedback loop. And I think that's emblematic of what happens to us personally, but also societally on an organizational level. The quick exploit decisions give us good feedback. The explore decisions often their initial feedback is negative and we don't find out whether it's going to pay off in the long run. And so the more we're focused on what do I get out of this decision, the more we tend to skip exploring to our detriment.
And we're also, you read about this, a society that feels very obsessed with habits. You know, we look at like the best-selling nonfiction book of the last decade is just all about how to hack your habits. But you're kind of wary of that obsession, right? Like you think that living too habitually is dangerous because it shuts down that explore mode.
Don't get me wrong. Habits are important. And like, I don't want to wake up every morning and be like, let me invent a new way of tying my shoes because I don't want to get stuck in a rut and always tie my shoes the same way. That's not productive.
Right.
But I think the best example of that is there was a pretty cool analysis of London commuting patterns before, during, and after a 2-day strike on the London Underground about a decade ago. And so this was an optional strike, so workers could show up or not. And so some stations were open and some were closed. So commuters could still get to work on the tube. It's just that sometimes they might have to go to a different station or switch to a different line or find a different route. So they did this big analysis based on the Oyster card data, which is the cards people use to tap on and off the subway. And they found a subset of tens of thousands of commuters who were hyper-regular. Like before the strike, they always went to work the same route every morning. They always came home by the same route every evening. Then there's 2 days during which they may or may not have had to go to a different station, try something different. After those 2 days, 5% of those commuters adopted a new route. So just the act of having to switch routes for a couple of days made 5% of them realize, holy crap, I've been doing this for 10 years every morning and every evening. And it turns out if I go this other place, it's shorter or it's more pleasant or it's less crowded or it gets me outdoors or, whatever the case may be. So I think that's a great example that just doing something every day, even if it feels like it's working well, doesn't guarantee you're doing the best. So you have to find a balance. You don't want to wake up every morning and say, should I go north, south, east, or west to get to work? It's like, oh, wait, going the opposite direction didn't work. There's a role for habits, but there's also a role for testing those habits periodically, for for exploring other options, just making sure there might not be something better out there.
And so that commuter example, does that rise to your definition of exploration? I want you to sort of talk about how you define exploration, because it's actually sort of a tricky term to pin down.
Yeah, it's whatever I need it to mean at that exact moment. It's a hard one because on the one hand, intuitively, you say explorer, I say Christopher Columbus, right? We associate exploring with what people who study this call firsting. Like the idea of exploring is being the first to do something or go somewhere. And of course, this is a highly problematic concept because, Christopher Columbus wasn't the first to go anywhere. and it becomes a very contested idea. And of course, for those of us living in the world today, there's very few things we can do that are truly firsting.
Exactly.
I spend a lot of energy trying to get to places where I can pretend I'm the first person to be in a place, but I have never been the first to go to a place. So that's an unsatisfying definition of exploring. At the same time, you can broaden it to say, well, it's trying something different. So it's like we're lying on the sofa and I don't like this show, so I'm going to change the channel. I'm exploring what's on the airwaves. And that's also an unsatisfying definition because it turns sort of everything into exploring. So to me, the middle ground is when I'm talking about exploring, I'm talking about something that involves making a choice so that you're taking an uncertain pathway. You don't know what the outcome is going to be, which inherently means that there is the possibility of failure. You don't know whether this is going to work out better or worse than the other option. And in general, I would add that this means that there will probably be some struggle, there will be some difficulty, that it's not just lying on the sofa changing the channel and the risk is that you get a bad show. You have to have some skin in the game. You're putting something at risk, you're taking a chance, and you don't know how it's going to turn out.
And I think that's so helpful because I definitely, before reading the book, did fall into the trap of like, exploring is a person with a backpack in the middle of nowhere wandering around. And I don't relate to that person at all. But discovering that, there are all these more quotidian applications of exploration is really helpful and really exciting, right? That it does come in all different shapes and sizes and isn't just this heroic march into the blank spots on the map.
Another distinction that I think is worth making that is this idea that exploring is a physical task, that it's about going somewhere in the physical world. Like we obviously know the idea of exploring ideas or exploring concepts. It's not just a metaphor. It's not just a comparison. One of the things I found really interesting is that the areas of our brain, like the hippocampus is where if we wander into a new territory, you're mapping that in your hippocampus. That's where we form our cognitive maps.
Mm-hmm.
We map ideas in the same way in the same part of the brain. Like in our hippocampus, we're mapping ideas and how close they are to each other, how they're related to each other. We're mapping our social networks. So what's going on in your brain is the same when you're trying to figure out where that trail leads as it is when you're listening to a new piece of music and you're not quite sure how this kind of music works, or when you're wrestling with a different idea. So to me, that was a surprise. I didn't see that coming, but I knew there was the metaphor, but I didn't realize that the neuroscience was actually like, no, this is the same.
In the book, you look at 3 lines of evidence to suggest that we're just natural-born explorers: anthropology, neuroscience, and biology. And we'll start with anthropology. Homo sapiens are around 300,000 years old, but 50,000 years ago, our ancestors did something astonishing. They spread out all over the globe. How do we know they did that? Why does it matter? And what can it tell us about our primeval instinct for exploration?
Yeah, this is a really new and interesting area of anthropology because there's been this explosion of ancient DNA, the ability to extract DNA from bones and to figure out, okay, who was where and who had they intermixed with and how did populations move? So we're really just starting, there's been a couple of Nobel Prizes that have come down the pike on this topic. One thing we know is that humans and their ancestors or their relatives, they were around Africa, the Near East, Europe, going back and forth for hundreds of thousands of years. So it's not like someone finally found the door out of Africa and then humans took off. So they were moving around in the same way that lots of other species move and expand a little bit as climate changes. And then sometime around, as you say, about 50,000 years ago, something changed. It's what Svante Pääbo, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on ancient DNA, what he calls the replacement crowd. All of a sudden, a group of our ancestors just started taking off. Everywhere they went, they took over. And within a few tens of thousands of years, they settled every habitable point on the planet.
Just amazing.
I maybe started with the assumption that, of course, we're born to explore. But then you start to think, how do oak trees spread? Well, acorns roll. And oak trees are in a lot of places, but we're not oh, yeah, the acorn just has this, lust for the open places and it dreams of what's over the next horizon. So you can't assume that just because a species spreads, it's exploring.
Sure.
But then you go to Easter Island and you're yeah, you don't end up on Easter Island just because, things were getting a little crowded back in, Indonesia. The conclusion that I come to based on, and I think would probably be the scientific consensus these days, is, you can't get to Easter Island, let alone to, Tahiti or whatever, without purposeful exploration. We ended up in the southern tip of South America. We ended up in the Arctic. It's there's a purposeful spreading out that goes beyond, that we need some new resources or we're getting crowded. It's no, there's something over there. We want to find out what it is.
And there may be a biological component to some of this dispersion, right? Talk about DRD4. This is mind-boggling to me.
This was part of the thing that convinced me there's something to write about here, that this is not just
interesting.
The philosophy of do we want to see new things? It's also, there's some biology here. So the DRD4 gene is a dopamine receptor. The key thing to understand about dopamine is that it's not like a pleasure chemical in the sense that you don't get a hit of dopamine when something is good. You get a hit of dopamine when something is better than expected. It's essentially a marker of prediction error. So you can think about this in the context of drug addiction. You take a drug and you've never felt like that before, so you get a hit of dopamine and that cues you to want to do it again. The 10th time you take a drug, you know exactly how it's going to feel. So there's no more prediction error. So you don't get the same dopamine hit. So then I need to take a bigger dose to get that. So there's this sense that it's always driving you to try something different. And really, if you want to experience something that's better than you expect, a pretty good tactic is to take the path where you have no expectations, where you don't know what to expect. In other words, to explore. By exploring, we're giving ourselves the best chance of getting that feeling of, wow, that was better than I expected. So anyway, that's why dopamine matters in this context.
Okay.
Now, about 50,000 years ago, that number should sound a little familiar, there was a new genetic variant that appeared that for some people changed the sensitivity of the DRD4 receptor. So essentially, getting an unexpected surprise would give them a bigger hit of dopamine. Right around that time, that's when humans started spreading around the globe. Now, there was a study in 1999 that asked, I wonder if the prevalence of this explorer's version of the DRD4 gene depends on what population you're in, how far you ended up away from Africa. And what they found is there's basically a linear relationship. If your ancestors walked all the way to the southern tip of South America, there are population groups there that 80% of them have this explorer's gene. If you look closer at home, in parts of Africa or in Europe and, on the island of Sardinia, I think it's 20% or something like that. So there's a big gradient depending on how far your ancestors roamed. And populations that are nomadic tend to have a higher prevalence of this explorer's gene than populations that settled into agriculture. So all of a sudden there's this link that our behavior, that our propensity to find out what's over the horizon is linked to our genes. And let me throw in one key bit of context here, I think. There's a tendency to say then, oh, now I get it. So some people are explorers and some people aren't. So some people will say, now I understand why I am the way I am. And other people will say, I definitely do not have that explorer's gene. Now I understand why, other people do these stupid things. And I would say that's overinterpreting it. That actually what this tells me is that we all have DRD4 genes. We are all wired this way. What the DRD4 gene is just doing what the variant, the explorer's variant, is just turning up the volume a little bit. So some people are definitely more called than others, but it's not that only some people are attracted to the idea of novelty. Even for people who are like, I definitely do not want to parasail to the South Pole, they may be seeking their novelty in cultural forms or cognitive forms or, other ways.
You used this term a moment ago, prediction error. And that brings us to one of the sort of neuroscientific explanations for why we are driven to explore. And you write a lot about this fascinating theory, which we've talked about a little bit on the show in the past, called predictive processing. So just remind listeners what that is and then connect it to exploration.
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying this is a new idea in neuroscience in the last 2 decades. And it's like a grand theory of everything. And discussions of it, as I found when I was researching this book, they get very deep very fast, as you'd expect for the theory of everything, right? Like if we're going to explain life itself, then here we go. But here's my attempt to explain the relevant parts for us. The idea of predictive processing is that all of life obeys this principle called the free energy principle, which essentially says that to be a living thing, you're wired to minimize surprise. You don't want to suddenly realize, oh, wait, there's a tiger behind that tree, or there's a giant pit of boiling tar right in front of my foot. You want to be able to predict what's happening around you. And so we're wired to try and basically predict what's about to happen. So our brains, in other words, are prediction engines. They're constantly running a model of the world. And the role of our eyes is not to say, hey, I'm looking at my table here and there's a glass of water. My brain has a model that says when you're sitting in this position in this office, there's a glass of water to your right. And what my eyes are doing is just double checking that my predictions are right. So all we're looking for is prediction errors. We're always looking for signals that tell us that, oh, we need to update our model of the world.
This is really trippy too, because I think we believe that our eyes are video cameras that are capturing in full fidelity everything we see around us. But in reality, like the processing that it would take for our eyes to constantly be relaying all the sensory data back to our brains in real time, like it would break down. And so we are living in this controlled hallucination where we sort of think that we're seeing things in real time. But in fact, as you say, it's our brain just predicting and hallucinating. Yeah, the glass of water should be right there. Okay, cool. Here we go.
Yeah. And this explains all sorts of like optical illusions or these experiments where that you have people like count the number of basketballs that are being bounced. And then meanwhile, someone in a gorilla suit is doing cartwheels right behind you. And then afterwards they say, so what did you think about the gorilla? And they're like, what gorilla? It's like the brain was focused on, we're doing a model where there's a bunch of basketballs. So we're just going to completely ignore everything else. Anyway, so it has a wide-ranging phenomenon, this idea that we're just kind of trying to predict the world. But there's a problem for the case that we're natural-born explorers, which is that if all we want to do is have great predictions of the world, we should go to the closet, turn the lights out, close the door, and just stay there, because then we're going to have perfect predictions. We know exactly what's happening next, which is nothing at all. This became known about a decade ago as the darkroom problem in philosophy and in neuroscience. Like, how do we resolve this idea that what predictive processing says, this grand theory of everything, says we should all just be locking ourselves in a dark room? And there's a few different ways of resolving this, but I think the one that's currently accepted is that we're not just trying to resolve surprise about what's happening right now or what's happening in 2 milliseconds. We're taking a much broader view. We want to know what's going to happen in the future. We don't want surprises tomorrow or the next day either. And in order to minimize surprise in the long run, we need to know as much as possible about the world. We need to be able to construct the most detailed model we can about how the world works. And so that predisposes us to devote at least some of our time, to at least some of the time, seek out the things we know least about. So we end up applying what scientists call an uncertainty bonus. So the less we know about something, the more we're attracted to it. It's not the only factor. So it's not like every time we know nothing about it, we're going to do that. But it's like all else being equal, like we're weighing all these options. Some are better, some are worse. But the ones we know least about, we give them a little extra bonus to their ratings that might convince us to go that way, just for the pure fact that we don't know what's going to happen there. And so we have the potential to learn. It's not that we love being confused. We love uncertainty because when we resolve it, we learn something new about the world. That's what's attractive to us.
And is there a sweet spot here? I mean, we don't, as you say, we don't want to lock ourselves in a dark room. That's very unsatisfying. But too much uncertainty, too many prediction errors is frankly just incredibly frustrating to us. So is there sort of a happy medium we're going for?
There is, and it's the holy grail. Like, babies can tune into this sweet spot. So if you take like 8-month-old babies and you show them like a sequence of toys or patterns or whatever, if it's totally predictable, you can track babies' attention with their eye gaze. Like if they're interested in something, they'll look, and if they're not, they'll look away. So you give them a totally predictable pattern, they're like, boring, they'll look away pretty quickly. If you give them a totally random pattern where you never know what's going to happen next, they will also tend to look away quickly. If you give them an intermediate pattern where there's some pattern, it's discernible. If they pay attention, they'll be able to figure out the pattern, but they can't quite figure it out. Then that is what will keep their attention the longest. So that's the early evidence for this idea of a sweet spot. Now, for adults too, and for the purpose of learning, like in computer science, there's something called the 85% rule. Let's say you want to learn more trivia or whatever. If someone gives you questions where you can't answer any of them, you're not learning anything. If someone gives you questions that are easy, you're not learning. And so if you're trying to teach a computer agent something, if they get 85% of the questions right, but 15% wrong, that's the sweet spot in some contexts of machine learning. In flow states, when people talk about flow states, the idea of a flow state is that you have a task that's just barely within your capacity, something that is not easy for you, but not impossible. To me, this ends up getting really fascinating because you can go back to Wilhelm Wundt, who was a German psychologist in the 1800s, really one of the guys who founded the field of psychology. He had this idea that's now sometimes called the Wundt curve between stimulus and response. So how intense or complex or unpredictable or difficult is a stimulus versus how much we enjoy it. And it's kind of like a bell curve. If it's super easy, we don't find it all that enjoyable. If it's super hard, we find that frustrating. If it's in the middle, we find that interesting and engaging, and we have the greatest potential to learn about the world. So the kind of holy grail for exploring is to be in the sweet spot of this Wundt curve, where you're challenging yourself, but it's not just wandering naked in the jungle until you get eaten by fire ants or whatever.
Right.
It's hard to do that. But I mean, I guess the simple thing I would say is the best tool we have for finding that sweet spot is like, hey, do I find this interesting? Does it seem to me that journalism would be more interesting than physics? Then go do journalism.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's start applying this exploration mindset to the real world and seeing what it yields. The book is full of a bunch of great adventure stories, kind of classic adventure stories. I mean, you write about Nellie Bly racing to beat the around the world in 80 days record, deadly expeditions to cross Australia from south to north. But to me, this, I guess, speaks to who I am. Some of the stuff I found the most interesting were stories of intellectual, scientific, artistic exploration, stories about how explore mode leads to innovation and creative breakthroughs. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that novelty seeking, that exploration consistently yields creative results.
Yeah. So, obviously all of us want to know, how do I come up with new ideas? And this is, as I write about in the book, like this was something that really stressed me out when I was doing my PhD in physics, because, the prerequisite of getting a PhD is you have to create new knowledge. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Where do I find new knowledge? If I knew where the new knowledge was, it wouldn't be new knowledge. So,
right.
Like, how do you figure out where to go? And so the most interesting work in this area is from a guy named Dashan Wang, who's at Northwestern University. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, he comes from a physics background, but now studies innovation. And he does this big data approach to studying career trajectories in a few different domains. So for scientists, he's uploaded every scientific paper for the entire career of tens of thousands of scientists. Mm-hmm. So then you can analyze, you have a metric for how exploratory these papers are. You can say, well, does it cite combinations of journals that have never been cited before? From one paper to the next, is this scientist staying in the same sort of subfield, or are they moving around trying different things? And you also have a metric for how successful the paper was, which is how often is it cited. So then you can say, what are the patterns in when scientists do their best work? And this is back 7 or 8 years ago, he identified this phenomenon of hot streaks, that throughout a career, most people tend to have one or more periods where they're doing what turns out to be their best work. The highly cited papers aren't randomly distributed across their career. And it's not always like the young scientists do it, or the middle-aged scientists do it, or the old scientists do it. It can be anywhere. And he's done similar things for artists, where he uploads like every painting known from an artist's catalog, raisonné, or whatever it's called. And then he has machine learning. He has to analyze the painting on this 200-dimensional scale of like right down from like what are the brush strokes like to what themes or what types of style is it in, what's the genre. And so then you can say, how similar is this painting to the previous one in this 200-dimensional space? And if it's far away, then you say it's exploring. If it's close, you're exploiting. And he did the same for movie directors, and you can see, which movies won Oscars and so on. So anyway, everyone's got hot streaks. They're randomly distributed. Everyone wants to know how to get to hot streaks.
Sure.
And so you might say, well, you need to be creative. You need to explore. But it turns out that's not enough. Just being super exploratory, that doesn't get you anywhere. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, just exploiting, just doing the sort of 10,000 hours, rise and grind, I'm just going to keep my nose to the grindstone and work. That also does not tend to lead to a hot streak. But if you combine them in the right order, if you explore then exploit, your chance of a hot streak starting, it goes up something like 20%. And that, this is intuitive, right? Before you do your 10,000 hours, you want to make sure you're choosing the right thing to grind at. So you want to explore broadly. So this really connects to some of what David Epstein wrote about in his book Range, about the idea of the benefits of finding a good fit before you zero in. So you want to be broad before you go narrow. That's maybe one of the most valuable rules of thumb to keep in mind in the real world, is that, you need to explore. You need to exploit. Ideally, you want to do it in that order. So you follow periods of exploration with periods of saying, okay, from that period of exploration, what was the most promising lead? Now I'm going to see how far I can push that lead, or push that avenue, or push that idea.
And I think this research also creates sort of an interesting link between exploration and curiosity, right? That you have to you have to get curious and then get focused. It's the scientists that go out and learn totally different fields or play games to amuse themselves, do things that seem completely unrelated and frankly unproductive and to their work. And yet it's that curiosity, that relentless curiosity, just gathering string that ultimately leads them to find interesting combinations between disparate or seemingly disparate ideas and produce something really remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, there's this age-old tension between, like, to get new things, should we be like, we need to build an electromagnetic wave machine, or should we just say, here's some smart people, let's let them do what they want to do, and oh, hey, look, one of them invented this thing called electromagnetic waves. I wonder if it will have any use. And again, like as with most things, if you push either direction to the extremes, you might say, well, if you're totally disconnected from the idea of what will this be useful for, maybe that's a problem. I don't know. Maybe it's always good for it to have a few people who are just like, I'm just thinking about whatever's fun. But if you're totally focused on, we need to build such and such a machine, I mean, that could work. We need to build a COVID vaccine. Well, I'll be darned. We built a COVID vaccine. But we wouldn't have built a COVID vaccine if someone hadn't been pursuing this idea of mRNA, despite the disapproval, because it didn't seem to have practical value. And there's this societal shift from like science to technology, from like we want to understand how the world works to we want to build useful gadgets. And paradoxically, I think the more we focus on building useful gadgets, the less likely we are to come up with the breakthroughs that enable really transformative gadgets.
So interesting. In this shift to utility, I mean, one of the other pieces of evidence that you cite or pieces of data that you cite in the book that I just found fascinating and depressing is that humanity is getting smarter. Our IQ is going up. Measures of creativity are going down. We are not exploring enough. We are not challenging conventional wisdom. And it's hard to see it not getting worse as the exploration gene sort of continues to soften in us.
Yeah, I mean, there's these big analyses of patents and of scientific papers, which analyze things like disruptiveness. To what extent are we producing scientific papers or patents that change the direction of a field? And that's been getting less and less likely or common over recent decades. And you can kind of make an argument that, well, we know a lot now. Of course, it's harder to come up with new ideas. But then you look at, there's this standardized test, the Torrance tests of creative thinking, which is sort of the creativity version of IQ tests. And scores for kids on these tests have been going down since the 90s. They have to renormalize the test periodically, and they're having to renormalize them to make them easier. And the rate of decline has gotten even steeper in the last 10 years or so, since about 2012 was that last renormalization. And that's harder to blame. It's not, that's nothing to do with we already know how electromagnetic waves work. This is just kids being asked to, come up with novel uses for a potato or whatever.
Yeah.
There's no like hard science that explains exactly why this is happening, but it's hard not to see a connection between that and free play, the ability to just play in a way that is not fed to you by an algorithm, to be bored and to come up with to say, well, I don't know, what should we do today? Midway through summer vacation, let's invent our own game. And it's tricky. Like I have kids, my kids are 8 and 11 right now. And, I'm highly sensitized to this issue, but my kids are supremely overscheduled. Like they have soccer like 18 hours a day, every day. And it's like, I don't want them to have that much formal stuff where they're being led by an adult through drills. But it's like, well, if you want to play soccer, that's the price. It's either you play house league where nobody even knows what a ball is, or you play this competitive version where it's like, yeah, you don't have any weekends off until 2029. And so it's hard to chart your own path because the societal structures and incentives really militate against unstructured free play for kids, but I would also extend that to adults. Like
100%.
We've got a crap load going on. I've got bills to pay. I've got kids to cook for or whatever. And so the chance to just be like, what would I do if I had an afternoon where I wasn't allowed to log onto my computer? I don't know. There's a lot of things I might do. And maybe it would be lying in the backyard reading a book or doing nothing. But it's like, it's hard. When we talk about creativity and going back to this idea of a sweet spot and finding the opportunities to learn. And I would argue that our most valuable, our most sensitive meter for detecting that sweet spot is what's interesting and curious to us. But that signal is usually overwhelmed by the signal of what deadline do I need to meet in order not to get fired or whatever that is. So it's hard for all of us, I think.
Totally. In a world of endless to-dos, it's very hard to carve out time for I mean, I spent a weekend recently trying to understand the game of cricket. And it was so fun.
You need a year, not a weekend.
I know. I'm still learning, but it was fun. And that is one of the advantages of the technological world that we live in, is that I'm on these Reddit threads and I'm watching YouTube videos and I'm listening to podcasts and there's documentaries. It's all at my fingertips. But it's very rare that I have a weekend where I can spend the whole time trying to learn the game of cricket, because normally it's like, oh, well, I need to go run this errand and I have to do this and I didn't finish this thing for work.
What's the utility of learning cricket? It's like amazing. You know, intuitively, you feel that was an awesome weekend. But when you're struggling with, or I could get ahead on this errand, I could do my taxes or whatever the case may be.
Exactly. You mentioned that you have young kids, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about sort of what you're doing to foster a spirit of exploration in them.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I'm failing because they spend all their time playing soccer. But it was interesting. I had a great conversation with a guy named Mark Malmdorf Anderson, who's a cognitive scientist in Denmark who uses the predictive processing framework to try and understand play. He's written a book on play. It's really, really interesting. Seeing play as basically it's kind of the counterpart of exploration. In exploration, we're seeking out uncertainty in order to resolve it. In play, we're creating uncertainty in order to resolve it. We intuitively make the rules of our game in order to have the satisfaction of resolving it. So one of the examples he gives is like, you take your kids to a park. They're like, oh, I wonder what it's like to go down that slide. They go down this slide a few times and it's like, now they know what it's like to go down that slide. So the next thing is they're like, I wonder what it's like to go up that slide. And you're like, no, don't go up the slide. There's kids trying to come down, but you can't stop them because they're very good at intuitively following the dictates of their curiosity, of their sense of fun, which in turn keeps them in that sweet spot. So his advice, and I was pushing him like, okay, but tell me 3 rules. How do I get my kids to have more opportunities to explore? And his simple advice was like, he tries to say yes a lot to his kids, because a lot of the things that the kids want to do, they seem, from our curmudgeonly perspective, they seem sort of stupid. It's like, oh, come on. Why do you want to pile the couch cushions to the ceiling? That's just stupid. Then we're going to have to clean them up. It's like, if the kids want to do it, that's their signal. They're following the dictate of what is interesting and is going to teach them something about the world. So you say yes as much as possible, as long as and then make them clean the couch cushions up afterwards.
Yeah, I love that. Just say yes to things. And I think it's good advice for adults too, right? Like we should just all be saying yes to our whims and our flights of fantasy.
I mean, not everything. You got to apply a filter.
Not everything.
Yeah. But exactly. At the very least, you want to try and find a way of tuning into what is it I would like to do in theory, because we're so tied up with what we should do that to be able to hear that voice, even if you can't always obey it, to be able to understand what it is you would like to be doing, that can be a good hint as to what would be a valuable exploration for you.
Something we've been just circling on this whole conversation is we are living in a period of exploration decline, perhaps. And I'd love for you to just put a fine point on it. Like, what do we lose in a world where we have lost our lust for exploration?
There's 2 ways, I think, to talk about what do we get out of exploration. There's the utilitarian, like we discover new things, like, and what are we losing now if we don't explore? There's not like continents that we haven't found or anything like that. But in a utilitarian way, we're maybe losing out on new ideas, new technologies. But the other way of answering it is to say, what's the reason to explore is because it feels good and feels meaningful. We embrace challenge and we push through difficulty and we accept uncertainty, and then we come out on the other side and it feels great. And I think those 2 answers are connected, right? Like, the reason it feels good and meaningful is because it was useful in the past. So it's our evolution's way of getting us to continue exploring, in the same way that the pleasant taste of sugar is evolution's way of getting us to pursue calories.
Sure.
We've seen in the modern world that link between sugar and calories we need is broken. So we have to say, even though it tastes good, we don't want to follow that dictate anymore. And I think in the modern world, in terms of exploring, the link between like the feeling of exploring and getting something useful out of it is not always, it can be broken in both directions. Like, I go on social media and scroll, and that's co-opting my exploring circuitry, saying, oh, you're discovering something new, but you're not learning anything in the world. You're just basically pleasuring yourself cognitively. But I think the opposite direction of saying exploring is only worthwhile for the, technological gains it will give us as a society is also not necessarily it's useful. Look, I want society to progress and blah, blah, blah. But to me, I think the message I would hope to leave people with is that exploring is an amazing source of meaningfulness, of a sense of purpose, of a sense of satisfaction when you take on, going back to this definition we talked about earlier, that it's accepting uncertainty and the risk of failure and embracing challenge and inevitable difficulty. There's some really interesting work in psychology about the link between what's called the effort paradox, the link between effort and meaning, that things that are hard, whether it's climbing a mountain or getting furniture from IKEA or having kids, these things that are hard tend to be, we rate them the most meaningful as the most meaningful parts of our lives. So what do we lose if we don't explore? I think our lives feel less meaningful and less satisfying. And to me, that's far more important than whether we get a better iPhone.
Well, I'm so glad you have written this battle cry for exploration, and it has inspired me to be. I don't know if I'm definitely not at the level you are. I mean, I'm not doing I'm not taking my family on extreme hiking trips, but I think that's okay. We have to explore within our own lanes, but still push ourselves a little bit. Alex, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks, Caleb. This has been a really fun conversation.
Alex Hutchinson's new book, The Explorer's Gene, is out now. Grab a copy by following the link in the episode notes. Also in the episode notes, you'll find links to 2 conversations that I think you will like if you enjoyed this one. The first is a conversation I had with adventurer Colin O'Brady, and it's about exploring your own backyard by going on a 12-hour walk. No phones, total silence. The other is my interview with David Grann, one of the all-time great nonfiction storytellers, about his book, The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, murder, and old-fashioned exploration. By which I mean, there's some scurvy. Today's episode was sound designed by Mike Toda. Our explorer-in-chief is Rufus Griscom. The Next Big Idea is part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Caleb Bissinger. See you next week.